Hi everyone, good to be here. My name is Luise Müller-Hofstede. I'm wearing two hats today. My one hat is in the role of member of the board for Catena X, which is automotive industry association, formerly founded in Germany by Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen, but also major tier ones such as Schaeffler, BASF, SAP and Siemens. And then I'm wearing my other hat, which is Director of Business Development at Circulor. Circulor is, let's say, my main occupancy. We are a startup scale-up founded in London 2018, looking at especially supply chains and the data that needs to come from suppliers. So today I'm talking about data and how supply chains demand radical collaboration to tackle challenges that we've already been hearing in the former session about sustainability, about a global regulatory landscape. So this is should show you where are we heading to as an industry, as an automotive industry. And I think you can see quite well here the good old times in the left corner, which is, you know, the purchasing division dealing with their first tier ones, and that was kind of good enough back then. And then we are currently in a time where the purchasing divisions need to dig deeper into supply chains and also engage with their selective tier ones to understand where are the carbon emissions coming from, to understand the resilience of the critical raw materials. So their responsibility extended into beyond tier one and direct suppliers, and looking at the suppliers they already know and how they can optimize the collaboration and also data transmission. But then what we expect is looking also deeper into 2030 and the close future, which definitely will require and demand the level of interaction with the suppliers to really understand who is sitting in my supply chain, where are the mine sites in my supply chains where I receive the critical raw materials from, and then an extended responsibility that goes beyond tier one and selective tier ends, but the entire supply chain, especially all the darker parts of the supply chains when we're looking at outside of Europe. So this is the journey where we are heading. And I think if I like to look at the level of interactions from purchasing division of the good old times and this being good enough, sort of like in the recent past, and then looking into the networks. And the networks is something that Catena X is doing. It's the industry came together for the industry, setting technical standards to better interoperate and to make a radical collaboration along the entire supply chain possible, and also the data that is required for it. So there are obviously, and we heard this also before, a multitude of challenges that the automotive industry is currently is facing. So, of course, the energy transition, there was, supply chain resilience, especially that became visible during the times of COVID. And then there's an absolute regulatory tsunami coming towards us, and partially also being there, and that is global, not only here in Europe. One of the main regulations I'm currently busy with is the EU battery regulation. So I will talk about that also a little bit more. But what is important is that all of these regulations, they are looking into the supply chain. They demand data that is coming from primary data coming directly from the suppliers to understand recycled content, to understand CO2 emissions, to understand all kind of ESG performances, and that from very reliable source. So the use of industry benchmarks and common databases with average values in there is not good enough anymore. All of those regulations, we heard it before, the Supply Chain Act as well. They want to make sure that the manufacturers in Europe or anyone who's placing products on the European market is well aware where the critical raw materials are coming from and if they have been sourced ethically, sustainably. And those demands will only increase in the future. I mentioned that one of my my topics is the EU battery regulation and the battery pass that comes with it. Obviously, that is a very niche niche field. Overall, those we can expect that for all kind of products, electronic products, products that contain a huge amount of critical raw materials such as steel or aluminum, for example, will require digital product passports. And this is the ESPR, European Sustainable Product Directive. And the first DPP, digital product pass, that will come on the market is the battery passport. The battery passport means basically that by 2027, every battery, every EV battery and also commercial battery that will be placed on the European market needs to come with a digital product passport that gives information about recycled content for the lithium, the nickel, the manganese, the cobalt, and also the CO2 emissions that come along with this battery, and again coming directly from suppliers, the values, and not through secondary databases. So this is just like a rough overview of how this global regulatory landscape looks like. And while we in Europe have the EU battery regulation, for example, especially where the automotive industry is currently busy with, we have another, it's more like a tax incentive, the Inflation Reduction Act in the USA. That's not a typical regulation, but if the manufacturers and especially the OEMs can make claims about their supply chains, about how much recycled content and where the materials have been mined or processed, their end customers will get a huge tax incentivization and a credit back. So again, all of that, what currently the global regulatory landscape is busy with is information from the supply chain. And in the end, data is nothing else than information requesting. So while all of this is a huge challenge and a huge difficulties also, and we heard it also here today before, is like we as the industry will need to change constantly and need to stay flexible. There's also a huge opportunity in that. And the opportunity is finally engage with the supply chain, finally get in contact with suppliers that go beyond tier one, and establish those connections and relationships by the use of the regulatory landscape and saying like, this is the future of how business is going to be done, especially here in Europe. So we are sitting in a lot of projects where the OEMs for the first time are looking at their beyond their tier one suppliers and meeting on a weekly regular basis to discuss challenges about how do we get this data, what is feasible, what is not feasible, and I think in those challenges there's a huge opportunity sitting in there as well. Circulor, I mentioned it before, is a startup scale-up founded 2017, and our main business is to look to trace critical raw materials in supply chains, and that is something of increased importance, once for responsible sourcing, but also for compliance with the regulatory landscape. And this hasn't been possible before. This is basically only starting to be possible due to the use and the availability of new technologies such as AI, machine learning, and blockchain, for example. So tracing raw materials and establishing supply chain traceability, especially in critical raw material supply chains, is something new. It is something that the industry is starting to engage with because they have to due to the regulations. You heard me talking about the battery passport, but also other digital product identifiers, for example. And once we create this backbone of traceability in supply chains, and it's quite difficult due to the complexity of the supply chains. Usually the critical raw materials are sourced somewhere in Africa, then they're being brought to China for processing, and then and product building. And once they are into components, they arrive back in Europe. So we have 3 continents with different regulations and different, cultural differences, and requesting data from those supply chains and those suppliers sitting in those different regions is rather difficult. Also because traceability is a concept that we all know since a couple of years. DHL, you track your parcel, or the eggs in the supermarket. There's a QR code, and to make sure that those eggs really came from the hens that are happily living on the countryside. That is a bit more difficult when we talk about cobalt and nickel and all the critical raw materials that end up in EV batteries. And I think that is also the main point about those regulations and what the industry also needs to change on, because when we are busy with the energy transition, and we always have to ask ourselves why we are doing this. And we are obviously engaged in this energy transition to decarbonize, to make our planet a better one. But unfortunately, it's not as easy as driving electrical cars. By driving electrical cars, there won't be much of a benefit to the planet. We just move carbon emissions from our streets to the production sites in China. And in the end, it's not about driving those electric cars, but driving change into those supply chains. And the change is only possible in a first step to establish visibility. Because if there is a dark room and somebody is asking you to look for something in a dark room, you won't find it. So the first step would be to switch on the light and then properly look for it. So traceability for me is also a metaphor for switching on that light. Understanding first who are my suppliers, how is the material really flowing in those supply chains, and then in a second step to engage with the suppliers and make hopefully things better. There's often, when we talk about sustainability, we often talk about tech and data, and that connection between data and sustainability is often not very well understood. So that's why I want to talk a little bit about this. Sustainability is a journey, and it's not a goal, and we won't be there tomorrow or in 2 years, but it is something that we constantly need to work on. And the biggest challenges to achieve sustainability, and sustainability is also such